Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, joined today by Dr. Otto Pohl, and the subject of our discussion will be the Circassians. And we're going to be kind of winding about in a number of respects. So this will be somewhat of a sprawling presentation. We got it together in very short order because we wanted to have this ready for the 21st. Today, which is a Circassian day of commemoration and mourning, marking their final defeat at the hands of the Russians and their expulsion in their several and separate groups from their homeland. So Dr. Pohl is with us today. He is a specialist, has done a great deal of research on minority populations within the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and Russia today. His focus, as I understand it, has not been heretofore on the Circassians. He knows quite a bit about German minority groups there. I understand he knows quite a bit about the Tatars as well. But he is familiar with the Circassians, and I'm very happy to have him here today. He's a accomplished academic and should be able to help us in discussing aspects of the war with Russia, the expulsion of the Circassians, their diaspora, and perhaps even we'll take a little bit of a look at the prospects for their return. But before we fire everything up, Dr. Pohl, I want to welcome you. And is there anything you would like to say before I get started? I have a number of provisos, caveats, that kind of thing.
No. I don't have too much to say. If you're not familiar with me, I'm around lots of places, but I've been on this show before, and I have my own YouTube channel, and my written work, a lot of the shorter pieces are easy to find on Academia EDU.
Excellent. Well, yeah, at the end, we'll, of course, shill your channel. Absolutely. Consider subscribing to Dr. Pohl. You can find him on YouTube. It's under Jonathan Pohl, is it not?
Yes, the YouTube is Jonathan Pohl, yeah.
P-O-H-L. If I don't have that link down in the description, then I will shortly add it.
I believe it is.
Okay, good. I was about to say shame on me.
Just follow Otto Pohl here, and then the link.
Okay, good. Well, the first thing that I need to say before we jump into giving people context for the Circassians, because many people don't know much at all about them, if indeed they've even heard of them in many areas of the West. The first thing I need to say is I'm not a Circassian. Dr. Pohl is not a Circassian. And we are certainly not experts on this subject, but I believe both of us know a fair amount about it, certainly much more than most people. But if anything that we present here contradicts the lore or wisdom of those who are actually Circassians, then go with those who have the expertise and come from the culture. The other thing that I should mention is that Circassian is a term that refers to the people. It's used by outsiders. They refer to themselves generally as Adige, as Abkhaz, Abaza, Abzak. They have their own names for their groups, Kabardin, Temirgoy, these kinds of things. There are also many issues with the language. You know, anything that we use as a term to refer to them is going to be a strange Romanized sort of approximation of the languages, as we'll see in just a minute here, exceedingly challenging. So let's jump into background for all of this. And let me go over here to sharing my screen. The first thing that we should look at is where these people are. They are in the Caucasus, this place that we get our designation Caucasians from due to some European and I think primarily German theories of the 18th, perhaps the 19th century that have since been revised. But we can get some sense of what's going on here by taking a look at the Caucasus, the region in question, and getting a sense of where these people were located. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and make this a bit bigger so everyone can see. Now, the Caucasus is today like a fortress wall for the south of Russia. and its geopolitical importance has to do with that. Its national security implications for Russia as a territorial border. It's also very much on the minds of geostrategists because it presents a sort of east-west transit point for pipelines and things. So that is one of the things that makes people today concerned about it. But let's stay away from our current circumstances and look at this
I got a
historically.
question.
Yes.
I have never seen Caucasus and Balkars called mountain Turks before.
Yeah, well, let's just focus on the part that is in green and the part that is in red here. This was useful simply because it gave us a very basic picture of roughly how these populations were distributed before the conquest. This is actually a good point to jump in and add another one of these caveats. The nature of the academic material and the resources available for this region varies. Its quality varies greatly. There is really not much in English about it. That is changing, and that's a good thing. But the primary resources for it are in Russian. And then, there's, of course, primary sources in Ottoman as well. But the thing is that we're forced to deal with, limited resources in English. I don't speak Russian. Dr. Pohl does, but his focus has not been on Circassian. So just, take everything you see here with a grain of salt. There are different ways that groups are defined. There are different ways that border lines are drawn. So just bear with us on all of that. So what we see here is this green area north of the Caucasus. We refer to the north and south as Transcaucasus and Ciscaucasus. You can see this sort of area up in here that's the white sort of empty space. And these are the high peaks of the Caucasus, so the populations don't get up into those as much. So north of this line that you can see running here is the North Caucasus, and below it is the south. This is the historical region that was occupied by the Circassians once upon a time. And this here is the Abkhaz, a related group. They generally roamed in this area. Now, in some periods, further back than the period immediately preceding the Russian conquest, they ranged further afield up in here. Some of the Adige reportedly being even as far away as the Balkans. They later went there in the late 1870s after another defeat. But they ranged in this area, and also they were in the Crimea for some time, particularly the Kabardine or Kabartai. So this green area was where they ranged once upon a time. This has changed quite a bit. Now, there are other groups that you should know about. I guess this is a good point to jump in with what we're dealing with definitions and the rest. I'm going to pull just a quick bit from this book by Amjad Jaimucha. He's part of the Circassian diaspora. This is one of the few resources on the Circassians. It's part of Rutledge's Peoples of the Caucasus series. Jaimucha is out of Syria. I've corresponded with him very briefly. Here we'll just give you a quick introduction. The term Circassians, the English equivalent of the Turkish Cherkess, denotes all or part of the indigenous peoples of the Caucasus who live north of the Caucasus Range, the formidable chain that divides Caucasia into the Transcaucasus to the south and Ciscaucasia, or the North Caucasus, to the north. There is no agreement as to whom exactly of those nations the appellation refers to, but three denotations are in use. The first, the most comprehensive, includes all the native peoples of the North Caucasus. And you'll see this particularly in the 19th century, where English writers will refer to Sheikh Shamil, who is an Avar over in Dagestan. They'll call him a Circassian. They'll even call Chechens, the Vainakh people, they will call them Circassians. That's the broadest use, and that's the most imprecise. A more specific use, here continuing with this from the introduction, excludes the Eastern Caucasians, the Chechens and Dagestanis, and encompasses only the Northwestern Caucasians, the Adigas, Abkhazas, and the now extinct Ubykh. That, by the way, is the version that I'm going to use. Basically, all the peoples who are speakers of the Northwest Caucasian language groups. Now, they add the most restrictive sense refers only to the Adigas, who are or Adige, who are composed of many tribes who speak mutually intelligible dialects that make up Adigabze, the Circassian language. So that is, you know, understand that these people have their own ethnonyms with which they refer to themselves. Circassian is a Western imposition that is a general term. However, it's the best known, so that's the easiest one to go with. Now, from whence come these people historically? Well, we've sort of covered this area. We know that there was a Kabardian kingdom, and that's sort of the center area of this green that we see, but it extended pretty wide and far, and even over into the Crimea at certain points. But they really start to appear and pick up in our historical records in the 1500s as the Golden Horn and the Crimean Khanate begin to wane in power. The Kabardians begin to extend here. They have a kingdom of their own. They built at least one city of their own, many towns and auls, which aul is a term for a mountain settlement. So yeah, another technical term. But the Kabardians are in here. You've got other groups like that split off, like the Beslanais. You've got the Temirgoy. You've got Bzeduch and other tribal groups within this.
But there are 12 tribes that are officially recognized.
Right, but that you run into some problems with that because, for example, the Jane are more or less extinct. They only exist in diaspora in places like Turkey. So it's a symbolism of theirs. You'll see it on their flag with the crossed arrows. Yeah, I like most the fact that they want to hang their hat on the number 12, but there are some historical issues with that. Again, if you're speaking to a Circassian, they tell you differently. Go with what they tell you. Anyway, so we start to see them appear historically in the records, 1400s, 1500s. Certainly by the 1500s, they're engaged in diplomatic communications with the Russians. They ally with them to fight against Tatars and other groups. You know, sometimes they're on one side, sometimes they're on the other, but generally the Kabardians have a pretty good relationship with the Russians from the 1500s forward. We're going to talk about that a bit, and Dr. Pohl will doubtless cover some of that, but I want to throw one other piece in here, which is from another book. This is on the Abkhazians. This is by Hewitt. He is a scholar who specializes in the Abkhazian languages, or Abkhaz language, and the Abkhaz are related to the Circassians. They're members of the Northwest Caucasian language group, and like we talked about in the definitions, not everybody would strictly call them Circassians, but for our purposes, we're using that definition. And there's a bit about their history I want to cover here. And it is just the possibility that some of these peoples in prehistory, this is a hypothesis, it's not certain, but that they originally came, the ancestors of the peoples who came to speak these languages perhaps originally came from Anatolia. So just a quick thing here. Besides the modern West Caucasian languages, other languages belonging to the same group might have existed in the past. Over recent decades, a hypothesis has been gaining ground according to which a genetic relationship existed between Abkhazo-Adivean languages and Hattic, the most ancient known language of Asia Minor, that is to say modern Turkey, spoken some 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Texts in this language written by Hittite scribes in cuneiform script were found during the excavations of Hattusis, capital of the Hittite Empire, east of modern Ankara. Hattians, who had created quite a high civilization of their own and who are regarded as the inventors of the metallurgy of iron, had made a substantial impact on the social organization and religious system of the kingdom of the Indo-European speaking Hittites. The first investigator of Hattic, E. Forrer, this is from 1919, established its non-Indo-European character and suggested its relationship with Abkhazo-Adivean languages. The same view was proposed at roughly the same time by Leichsteiner, this 1923. The main reasons were striking structural similarities, particularly extensive use of prefixation between this ancient language of Asia Minor, extinct since the early 2nd millennium BC, and the languages of the West Caucasian group. Now, other people have since looked into it. Much of this is controversial, so it's just a hypothesis. But bear in mind, it's out there. Let's see here. One last little point we can make. It has been suggested that Hattic was related to the language of the Circassians, the warlike tribes inhabiting the vast mountainous territories to the north of the Hattians in the Anatolian Black Sea coastal area. The union of the Circassian tribes was a rather formidable power, which caused much strife for the neighboring Hittite kingdom, whose rulers had tenaciously to fight the turbulent mountaineers until the very end of the Hittite state. So yeah, it looks like there is the possibility that these people came in, thousands and thousands of years ago from parts of Anatolia. But this, again, is a hypothesis. What is certain, absolutely certain, is that they have for well over 1,000 years, probably well over 2,000 years, almost certainly, well over 2,000 years, been in roughly this area that we see marked as green, with some variations, additions, differences, and the rest. The first time we have clear evidence of an ethnonym for these groups is, I believe, in some stuff from the 1st century AD. So anyway, they've been there for a very long time. They have a claim to the land and territory, or did once upon a time. Now we're going to jump over to a more modern map of the distribution of these peoples. Now, much of that orange area that you see there, that's considered, settled by Russians now, but quite a bit of it was once upon a time the region of the Circassians. So Russia has completely swallowed them, so to speak. And now what we can see here, the little areas where they still remain after having been defeated and expelled for the most part from their homelands. You can see here around Krasnodar Krai and Maikop, the Adygea and the rest, these little purple areas are remnants of their populations where they've managed to stay. There's Cherkass here, which I believe is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Otto, but this I believe is the Karachay-Cherkass region. And then this area over here that's lighter purple, Nalchik, is the remnants of the Kabardians. And then we've got the Abkhaz remaining in here.
Abkhaz are south in Georgia, north.
Yeah, these are the. Can you see my arrow?
Yeah, I see the arrow. But you were pointing over. You were over in the Kabardino-Balkaria.
Well, these are the Abkhaz.
Yeah, those are the Abkhaz.
Right. These are the Osseti following the old Georgian military highway. Right. These are the Kabardins. This is the ones that are in the Karachay-Cherkass region, and these are the ones in Adygea.
The Ossetians there.
No, these are the Ossetians.
No, the Ossetians are the dark brown, and then the Chechens are the green.
This is Ossetia right here.
Right, that's what I said. That's the dark brown.
Then there must be some delay because, okay, I'm going to say it. My arrow is moving up and down.
Yeah, you're in
That's
Ossetia.
Ossetia, right?
Yes.
This is Abkhazia.
Your arrow hasn't gone to Abkhazia. It's still in Ossetia.
Oh, then there must be some delay. Is it there now?
Still now it is. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So there's. Oh, you're watching. You must be watching on YouTube.
Well, yeah, because I want to see what the people are seeing.
Oh well, that's going to cause some issues. That's why we normally work through the window here on StreamYards. But do as you like. Anyway, this is how the language groups are broken up now, and in many respects, a lot of these populations have been moved out and sent to other places. So once upon a time, it was even more of a patchwork of tongues. What you have to understand is that wave after wave of invasion came through this region, and the peoples who lived here over thousands of years were, in many cases, driven up into the mountains where they occupied what I mentioned earlier, these things called auls, these mountain villages. And you would have situations, and it still do today in many places, where in one valley, there's one language spoken, and then you go over the ridgeline to another valley, and it's an entirely different language or people. But what's odd about this and this whole region is that to some extent they have a number of things that are shared culturally. They don't share spoken languages, but they do share the use of damgas or chipche, which is to say tribal or clan signs. They do share clothing. Historically, many of them wore the cherkeska. Many of them carried the kama or kinjal. They wore gaziri, or what are called barutluk, the powder tubes on the chest. They share dance. In many respects, they have differences and variations, but you'll see people that will call it Chechen dance. You'll see people that will call it Circassian dance. And of course, the Georgians will all come in and claim that all of it came from them in the first place. And in fact, it's all theft culturally from the Georgians. The point I want to make here, even Jews in the mountains would wear cherkeskas and kamas. Some Armenians as well. There were Kurdish populations frozen up in here as well. Lach, Dargin, Karachay, Balkar, Lezgin, Chechen, Avar, like all these groups are packed up in here. But we're going to focus on the Circassians, though we're going to bear in mind that there are a number of shared cultural elements, and some groups will claim that these things were, originally with them or whatever. Like I'm sure Georgians would come in and tell you that the Cherkeska is actually Georgian, not being aware that it's based on a Qajar type of court coat that had the barutluks added to it at a later period. But anyway, we can see that there's just a vast number of people up in here, and that all kinds of interesting elements have been frozen over time.
The theory that the Karachay are partially descended from the Khazars?
No, but lots of people like to throw the idea of Khazars up in here. I don't know, I don't know enough about that, and I haven't looked at anything having to do with Khazar genetics.
Khazaria was a very important kingdom when it existed, but it seems to have dissolved as far as having any ethnic descendants. But Kessler wrote that book, The 13th Tribe, claiming Ashkenazi Jews were descended of the Khazars who had converted to Judaism.
Yes, that is an argument I'm familiar with. I am not qualified to say whether I buy it or not, although I'm familiar with that history and the business of the Khazars choosing their religion and having the envoys come. Generally, from what little I know, the idea is that it's elites who adopted Judaism, and there's a question regarding how much of the actual population did rather than the ruling class. But let's set that aside for the moment because we've got enough to cover here. I'm going to jump over here. For genetics, I couldn't find much. I'll just read this basic stuff out. This is all I could find out online. Interestingly enough, it's called Khazaria.com, to Pohl's point from just a moment ago. But I'm no mentat for genetics. This is just what I found online. Talk about the Circassians being an ethnic group native to the Northwest Caucasian region. They've been there for thousands of years. The Western group calls themselves Adige. So this is stuff we've all covered already. Deportations they mention. Languages we're going to talk about in a minute. Here's the important part. They say research by Behar et alia found that the Adige people are mostly West Asian, but also have South Asian Pakistani region. Now that's historically the Pakistani region. They're not saying that they're necessarily related to Pakistani people. They're saying that they have West Asian and South Asian, as well as Northeast Asian elements. On average, they say the Adige have about 5.7 to 5.9% Siberian ancestry, 7% South Asian ancestry. They say U is the most common mitochondrial DNA haplogroup among the Adige, with a frequency of 32%. Of these, 14% belong to U3, 8% to U5, 4% to U2, 4% to U4. Haplogroup H is encountered, that's mitochondrial DNA, is encountered among 22% of the Adige, of which 8% belong to H1 and H3. T is found among 14% of those tested, followed by I with 6%, J with 4%, X2 with 3%, K with 2%, W with 0.5%. And they have some other haplogroups involved. And then finally, we've got this business about one database saying 7.6% of the 106 Adige people studied carried at least one T allele, a gene which usually causes red hair. Let's jump over here. This is a diagram showing the language groups. Let me see if I can get that bigger. If it goes any bigger. No, it doesn't. But we can see here, basically, you've got, if you can't read it, it's Proto-Northwest Caucasian. That might be related to Hatik coming from Anatolia, like we talked about. And then we have sort of Proto-Circassian, which gives us Kabardin, or Kabardian, and Adige. And then over here on the other side, we have Proto-Abkhazian and Ubykh. And that also includes Abaza. But let's jump out of that because that diagram is not big enough to be useful. Yeah. So they didn't really have a written language of their own until pretty late in the 19th century. In the Eastern Caucasus, you had people adopting Islam very early on. The Circassians did not adopt Islam as strongly as like Shamil and the Murids and the Chechens and the Avars. They tended to adopt it more loosely. They have very much kept sort of their earlier traditions in many respects, and some of them are even Christian. But this is interesting that I just wanted to hit down here about the genetics. This will be a little bigger. Hopefully you can see it. This yellow area is the Adigo-Abkhazian sort of groups. And then the blue area here is Iranic, which is to say the Ossetians. Yeah. And then you've got the Nakh.
Vainakh, yeah.
And Vainakh, yeah, which is
in English.
Right. And then you've got Dagestan, which is Avars, and these other groups, Kaitag,
right.
Lesbians.
But for a long time over in Dagestan, when Shamil was the leader, the official language was Arabic.
Yes. Well, they basically, the Eastern Caucasus, Dagestan has a much closer relationship with Persia and had much stronger influence coming from there. And doubtless, picked up Islam earlier and more thoroughly, the Murids being pretty ferocious Muslims. And we can see that today with Chechens still fighting and, Salafist, either terrorism or activism, depending on how you want to define it, being, going on in the Eastern Caucasus there. The Circassians didn't pick it up as much. And during the period of the big war against the Russians, Shamil sent some of his top people to try to bring the Circassians into the fold to unite, and did not have much luck. Their distinctions and differences with the Northwest Caucasian groups, it was difficult for them to form a united front. But let's jump over. Let's take a look. Enough of the bland talking. Let's jump over here and take a look at what the people look like. I just have a few examples here I wanted to share. These are some of the men. Let me just do it this way, and that way we can see it. Now, we're going to be talking later about, more recent history and the rest. I don't want to give the impression that, the Circassians of today are just a bunch of guys riding around in chainmail with swords. However, my approach to them, my background with them comes from studying their material culture. And so there are, for me, this was the point of ingress. And culturally, I find it very, very interesting in terms of material culture. I find it very, very interesting. Now, these are 19th century photographs, obviously, but these people are wearing traditional gear and fighting equipment and the rest. And because I know something about their gear, I can tell you that this is all authentic. Only one that's a little bit odd is the guy over on the right who's wearing more of a Persian style helmet, but the helmets with the camel or whatever on the two guys in the center are absolutely correct. Those are true Circassian. That's true Circassian gear. The guy who's second from the right has a Tatar saber. You have to remember that the Kabardins and other Adige groups were in Crimea for a long time. They had a lot of intermarriage with the Crimean Tatars. And there are aspects of the Tatar aesthetic, as we'll see in a bit, that carry over to them. But just to give you an idea of the people that we're talking about, They were wearing this chainmail in some cases. Like you can take a look. I heard stories about the Khetsur, which are a highland tribe of more related with the Georgians. But just to give you perspective, they came down, it is said, out of the Caucasus Mountains in the 1920s, well after the Tsar had been killed while the Civil War was going on. They came down wearing chainmail and wearing swords in the 1920s and said, we want to help the Tsar. So you can see that they were not of the contemporary world in many respects. Let me get back over here. Here's another one. This is in better resolution. You can see the typical type of helmet they wore. You can see the bazubant, the armor that's worn on the forearms. When you look at how they move their arms in the dance, and if you imagine them having this armor on their forearms, then the martial vestiges in their dances will perhaps become apparent to you. Again, you can see a Tatar saber there. It's important that you see that the grip is covered in ray skin, but I don't have time to go into all that right now. Here's a more typical, this is the appearance of a Circassian. You can see he's got the kama on, he's got the shashka, or the kama or kinjal, which is the dagger in the front. You can see the shashka worn at the hip. That is, of course, with blade up, which is the same way the Japanese carried their swords, which allowed them to swiftly in one motion draw the sword and cut without having to like change their position. So they could draw and cut in a single motion. On the chest there, you see what are called gaziri or barutluk. Those are powder tubes. Each one of those is a wooden tube. These appear to be capped with ivory at one end, and then they're plugged with felt. And each one of those contained one charge sufficient of powder for the rifle. They would also carry a pistol. They'd, of course, have a kamcha or a riding crop. But this is sort of the typical dress of Circassian of the 19th century. These are what the, I'm not sure what this group is. They might be Abkhaz, they might be Shapsukh. I'm not really sure. I doubt anyone actually is really sure. But this is what, you know, think about these proud warriors at the end of more or less 60 years of uninterrupted warfare, certainly 30 years of uninterrupted warfare, with their final defeat as they were being packed into ships to die of disease after they'd been starved. Many of them would go to the bottom of the Black Sea. That's what these people looked like as at their last moments as they were being deported and destroyed. So, you know, this tiny group of people up in the mountains of the Caucasus fought against the Russian Empire for 60 years. And they were armed with chainmail and swords, and they were dealing with things like Russian artillery, and they managed to hold out for 60 years. But sadly, this is what they looked like at the end. Now we can take a look. Here is an aristocrat. They had each of their different tribal groups had different sort of social aspects. All of them had an aristocracy once upon a time. The Shapsukh rebelled against their aristocracy and introduced a different kind of social order that was, in some respects, more egalitarian. Now, don't confuse that with our ideas of egalitarian today, but they did drive out their aristocracy in the, I think it was from the very end of the 18th century up through the first 20 or 30 years.
And they've kept that kind of social organization in the tiny settlements, well, I guess relatively small settlements they have in Israel.
Yes, the Shapsukh did, settle in Israel and in Jordan significantly. I think most of the groups in Jordan are Shapsukh. But now I'm not sure, of course, that this guy is Shapsukh.
The Shapsukhs are too small. I mean, Jordan has a huge Circassian diaspora. It's over 250,000. There's only like 5,000 in Israel.
Yes, but my understanding is Shapsukhs formed the bulk of the people who settled in Jordan. Do you know differently?
Yeah, I think that they.
Well, take a look and let me know while I'm just covering.
Okay, I'm not exactly sure, but I'll check.
Yeah, and at the same time, remember, people, take all this with a grain of salt. There are doubtless areas where I'll be wrong on details, but I just want you to see the people. Now, there are some important things to realize. Notice how narrow this guy's waist is. By tradition, you were never, ever, ever supposed to be fat as a Circassian. Like, that was like way off limits. It did not happen. Their culture and their tradition is all about grace of movement, hence their interest in dance, the having of slender waists, a strong fashion sense, as you can see from this guy, certainly with the aristocracy. And it was very much tribal organization and aristocratic with most of these groups. The Shapsugs, you know.
The Shapsug were the first Circassian settlers in Jordan, but then there came Karbadians and
Abzak, yeah, and Kabardin. Yeah, that would make sense. Well, yeah, that would make sense because they had fought against the Bzeduch and Khamish, and probably would have some vestiges of resentments and the rest. But note that he's got his traditional dress. He's got the Cherkeska. The Barutluks are, they wear them at different heights on the chest depending on fashion. But you can see that this guy's handsome, refined, concerned with posture and appearance. They were refined people in many respects. Now let's take a look at the women. The Circassians were known as great beauties and were brought to harems in the Ottoman Empire. You have to understand that these peoples were traded. They had a tradition of slavery that it's not exactly precise to call it slavery. It's certainly slavery, but they could bond themselves into contracts. So some of them were absolutely captured and sold as slaves. Absolutely. And there was a huge trade in it in the Caucasus. And actually people's wealth could be counted in terms of households of slaves.
And the Malmuks were of Circassian.
Yes, starting with Baibars in the 13th and 14th centuries. The Circassians came down as Mamluks, which is warrior slaves, and they dominated parts of the Middle East for quite some time. In fact, one of the only serious defeats that the Mongols suffered was against Baibars. His troops, hopefully I'm remembering that right, defeated a Mongol army. So they were one of the few that could stand up to them and kick ass and take names.
But that's okay because the Mongols just sacked Baghdad a second time.
Right. They tended to be a vindictive lot, and they would make sure no stone was left standing one upon another. But the women were known for being quite beautiful and were, ended up in the harems of Istanbul and places like that. But we know of them today. You'll see something. I didn't include any pictures because I just find them ridiculous. But there's this whole idea of Circassian beauties that appeared in Ringling Brothers type freak shows, and they've all got like frizzy red hair. It's ridiculous. It's a freak show phenomenon. Don't get it confused with the actual Circassian women. I wanted to show you a few examples of them so you can get a sense of who they are and what they look like. Now you'll see that they've got these clasps on the front of the clothing there underneath the overdress, and those link. They sort of snap together. They don't quite snap. They link together. There's a domed metal part on one side that fits into a loop on the other side. And they're rigid down the front of the chest. There is a tradition, because blood feuds were very common with Circassian tribes, that if someone could get into the region of the tribe that they were feuding with, and if they could get a woman to allow him to put her nipple in his mouth, then they would be considered milk brothers, and the tribe that was after them wouldn't be able to do away with them. These people were very, very serious about kanluk, or blood feuds. But I think something about the way in which those clasps are metallic and cover the breasts and form sort of a protective barrier, in addition to being fashionable, might relate to that whole tradition in some oblique sense of having access to the woman's breast as a way to escape blood feud. But anyway, taking a look at the women, here's a more modern photo of a Circassian woman wearing traditional dress. I recommend that all of you go and take a look at Circassian dancing. Let me see. Yeah, we have one further one. This is traditional Circassian dress. Note the emphasis on the narrow waist, and that went for men as well. And you really have to go and look at Circassian dance as well as the jigits, the horsemen, in order to get a sense of how spectacular their physical prowess is, their movement, their dancing, their horsemanship. And they were also well known as marksmen and archers. I've actually had the opportunity to handle a Circassian bow and arrows, and it was like, wow, those arrows are big. And wow, those arrows actually taper from the back end all the way down to the point, the entire length of the shaft. It was something of a learning exercise for me. So let's just jump over to a few little things. I just wanted to show you some stuff. Well, here, first I'm going to put this one up so you can see it. If anyone happens to watch this, this I got from Circassian diaspora people in Turkey. This is all, I think, in Russian, though it might be Cyrillic characters showing Adigadze.
No,
I'm not sure.
It doesn't look like it's Russian.
Yeah, so this appears to be a hand-drawn map using Cyrillic characters, but written in Kabardin or Adige or Abaza or something. And it seems to be as of 1830, and it names all the villages and their locations. And if anybody comes along who can help me with this, I would be happy to send it to them. I would really love to have a transliteration because it will help me in my translation work. That's something I didn't mention. I'm translating. Let me see if I can share this with everyone. If I still have it up, is this? Is it? There it is. Let me get it over here where everybody can see the title page. And get up to the top of it. I'm translating this, which is Kafkasya kabilelerinin alamet ve amirler. Oh, hell. I'm not even going to embarrass myself sounding out through these, but basically it's marks of the Caucasian tribes and some stories and notable events related to their leaders. And it was published by the Bulatuk Press in Cairo in the 1890s. And it's based on research that was conducted in the Caucasus starting in 1865 by a Circassian of Ziduk, as it happens. And he was sent up there by his master, who traded horses. It's actually famous for being the origins of the Blunt, the Wilfred and Emily Blunt Arabian stud. Originally came from this guy who sent his man, who wrote this book, up there to collect the marks of these tribes, which they branded on their horses, but they also put on their equipment.
Yeah, looking similar to the Crimean Tatar Tamag up there.
Yeah, this is the first one. This is the Crimean Tatar Tamga or Chipche. It's called the Tarak or comb or rake. Yeah, this is a Tatar, but they modify them. Now these appear on all sorts of gear. So let me just show you here. I want to show you some saddles because I also want you to just get a quick taste of the material culture aesthetic. This is a Circassian saddle from a private collection. This one appears to be heavily influenced by Kurum Tatar aesthetic. So you can see here that they've sort of pebbled the surface, matting the background of these patterns so that it resembles that ray skin that I mentioned earlier that you saw on a sword hilt. But this is sort of the look of these saddles. And this is, in fact, a damga, perhaps with a secondary one right here. What I'm getting at is those damgas that we just went through. Here's another one. They tend to be hidden, and they appear on the pommel of the saddle to identify the rider. Here's a set of stirrups. Now, just for the record, this is from the Eastern Caucasus. This is more Kubachi style. This is less Circassian. This is Tatar and Cherkess style, a nice pure example. And this is a very, very pure example of the Circassian aesthetic with the damga appearing on the saddle pommel. But anyway, that's just sort of a brief way of jumping in here and sharing some background. We've covered where they are in their region. We've covered something about the people, their language, a little bit about the genetics, the historical context, and all the rest. Now, they ended up fighting with the Russians. And as we could see from that last picture of them after they were driven from their homelands, it didn't work out well for them. Hundreds of thousands of them died, starved to death, killed in battle, drowned at the bottom of the Black Sea, scattered across the world. Many of the groups, like I think it was in the 60s, that the last speaker of a native speaker of Ubykh died. So the language is now extinct. They're super rare languages to start with. So they really caught a raw end of the deal. Now I'm going to be turning this over to Otto here in just a second. There is this good book though by Richmond, which Otto Pohl turned me on to. He makes a lot of points about what the Russians did with the Circassians and more importantly, to the Circassians and many other groups, Chechens, Caucasus. One thing, however, that I don't think he's quite fair to the Russians in the sense of talking about how difficult these Circassians could be to deal with. And I'd like to give you some flavor of that as a balancing act for everything that we're about to hear, because there are two things. One, the Russians catch hell about this all the time, and in many respects, they absolutely deserve it. In my view, what they did to the Circassians does qualify as a genocide. Certainly, in my view, I know this is going to rankle a lot of people, qualifies as a genocide far, far more so than what happened with the Armenians in Turkey. So as far as I'm concerned, I realize, again, this is contentious, controversial. I don't want to hear anybody talking about the Armenians until we get the Circassians taken care of, because I think they have a much better claim to things being a genocide. My Armenian friends are doubtless not going to be happy with me now, but there it is. So the Russians catch a lot of hell for it. I want to say that the British probably deserve a whole lot of hell for it too, because they pushed up the hopes, attempting to peel away parts of the Caucasus from the Russians. They pushed up the hopes of the Circassians and then left them with their asses hanging out a window. So, just pointing your fingers at the Russians is not fair. I think the Brits take a lot of blame for, or should take a lot of blame for what happened. But the main thing I want to underscore here before we get on to talking about the war, and I turn it over to Otto, is how difficult things were among the Circassians themselves. They were never able to unify in the way that the Eastern Caucasus was able to unify. And consequently, they were not able to to stand in the face of the Russians as effectively as they did in the Eastern Caucasus. Now, Shamil, correct me if I'm wrong, he fell in what, 1858 or 1859? Somewhere right in there?
I think 1859.
Yeah. Now, the Circassians held out longer, but that really is mainly because the Russians had to focus so much on Shamil. And once Shamil dropped and the Crimean War was over, they were able to turn all of their attention on the Circassians. And within a few short years, their resistance was wiped out. But they were never able to unify. And that is a major problem that they have, that they had historically. And there are issues with them doing so today. Now they're taking steps in that direction. But it's something that you should be aware of. And I want to illustrate it. This is, the Ottoman text that I just showed you. I have translated part of it. I'm almost finished now, but this part I had translated some years back. It's in a book I helped edit and published in. But anyway, let me read this to you. This is about a very famous Circassian called Bulatuk or Bolatokwe. I just translated it directly from the Ottoman as Bulatuk. So it talks about his Damga, which looks perfectly like a U. Damga of Bulatuk. He is a great leader and noble from the Kemgoi tribe. He is from the tribe that the Crimean Khan took with him and left as representative when he went to the Circassians. This Damga's possessor is a person named Bulatuk Musost. He was extremely unjust and merciless. Of his affairs, we will here write 3 stories. As was the cruel custom of Bulatuk's tribe, the day he left the cradle, mounting his first horse, with a few persons of a brave sort, attacking a village, he seized a boy named Shupeshis and returned. The village inhabitants came and asked for the child. He, Mosost, said he would not release him. They, the villagers, presented 3 times his value, but he, Mosost, did not agree. Second story. An individual from among the Amir's leaders of the Kabartai came to Mosost. He said, I have 65 houses of slaves. In each house, such and such a number of inhabitants are found. All the men and women became rebellious. They have abandoned my service. I want to get rid of all of them at once. But if the Kabartai leaders get news because of their jealousy of me, they will incite all my slaves to rebellion, or make them flee 1 or 2 at a time. Now then, I have come to request that you find a remedy for this. And Mosost, Bulatuk Mosost, saying, very good, you go and be at ease. I'll do this business and settle your difficulties out of consideration for you. He gave his word on the matter. The Amir believed him and made a return to his land. As for Mosost, saying, God's sustenance falls complete at our feet. On the 21st of the month, a favorable dark night, the brave swindler, with 300 persons goes, falls suddenly upon the wretched slaves, and bound one to another, carries them to the lands of the Ubich at 5 days' distance and sells them. On his return, the Emir also came with joy, thinking, we will take the money. But because Mosost is one of those men who takes but does not give, by peaceful means, the Emir could not get so much as a single coin. Also, by force, he could not recover it. In short, Mosost ate it all up. Third story. There was a village rich in livestock, said to be a village of the Kipchak Tatar tribe. It was in a fertile mountainous area and wild open country. In the 2nd month of spring's first bloom, he fell upon the aforementioned village with soldiers, drove away all the livestock, and carried them off. Notable men of the village went after him and begged for the return of their animals. He did not consent. Later, all the women, taking their children on their shoulders, came to Musost's dwelling. O Amir, we have given up the other livestock, but offspring of the cows that newly gave birth remained in our houses. They are crying out, they will die from hunger, and some of us have no milk. So we feed the majority of these children with milk of our cows. Wailing, saying, give up the cows that newly gave birth, they begged, even though again he did not consent. They once more entreated him, saying, we have abandoned everything, all other requests. By arranging for a cow for the children of every 3 houses, send us back contented. Again he did not agree, saying, yes, you have a claim, but I too have a claim. I am compelled to protect my rights because I have made a law for myself, that I will not give back anything that comes into my hands. Do not tire yourselves for nothing. With this reply, every inhabitant of the aforementioned village took their children to their breasts and shoulders, and gathering at the edge of a river, recited curses and maledictions upon the cruel Emir, and before long he perished. Only a few from his kinfolk survived. Whoever from among them becomes chief perpetrates as much injustice as he can. In the time of the late Sheikh Shamil, these tyrants were driven out. Now, this story, you might find members of Bulatuk's tribe, Kemirgoy or Kemgoy or Kengui. They might come and say, oh, that's nonsense. That's just some Bzeduk talking nonsense. But the important point is that you see that this is a source. I translated that from Ottoman. That's a story gathered by a Circassian in the region while their culture was still alive. And believe me, I've translated many more. These people would backstab each other, chain people up, and burn them at stakes, calling them witches, according to the stories I found. Murder people and throw them into canyons, steal people and sell them into slavery. So there's a lot of nobility. There's a lot of interesting stuff. But the infighting, the violence, the slavery, and the rest of it was a very real thing. So you can come after the Russians, and I believe they should be gone after, so to speak, for their responsibility for this, and the British too, almost as much as the Russians for pinning the people between these, sticking amidst the Charybdis and Scylla of these geopolitical circumstances. But you have to understand that they weren't exactly super easy to deal with for Russians either, and so the kind of attitude or approach taken by Walter Richmond here is a little bit like, Sweetie Snowflake, a little bit of a leftist vibe on it. But now, I have been talking for a long ass time. You've been patiently waiting. I know you have all kinds of good material for us. Where did you want to start? Did you want to start talking about the war and how it got going?
Yeah, well, I guess kind of there's like 2, things to approach here. First, I think which you hadn't really focused on is the geopolitics, and so the Circassians are one of two major powers that are between Russia and larger powers than the buffer states in the Middle East proper. So being Iran, Persia under the Khazars, and of course the Ottoman Empire. So in the Caucasus, the major buffer between Persia and the Ottomans and the Russians is Circassia, and then on the Black Sea, the Crimean Khanate, which is openly allied with the Ottomans, and in fact is in conflict for quite some time with the Circassians. The Circassians, before the defeat of the Ottomans by the Russians, are variously times allied even with the Russians against the Ottomans before Peter the Great makes his first military strike against the Circassians. So under Catherine II, finally, the Crimean Khanate is completely eliminated as an independent state. It's annexed into the
And let me just
Russian
add,
Empire.
when that happens, when the Crimean Khanate is crushed, a number of them moved up into the mountains and started to live, for example, with the Kabardines. And you'll still find that there are many Circassian names. Like one of the most famous sources is a writer named Khan Girai, who is a Circassian author of the 19th century. We rely on him for quite a bit of the history. Certainly Richmond does, but note his last name. It's Khan Girai. And of course, the Girai dynasty were the Crimean Khans who ruled to the end. So there's quite a bit of intermarriage.
And most of them migrated to Constantinople and live under Ottoman protection.
Yes, but there are many who claim that surname, and you can tell from that there is an Asiatic look to a number of Circassians that's been observed, and there definitely was marriage and alliance. No, I'm not referring to Nogai. That's a totally different
group. Nogai influence. The Crimean Tatars that look Asian is because they have Nogai.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. I see what you mean. Yes. Yes, there's Nogai blood in there, but their original. The
Crimean Tatars are very heterogeneous in their ethnogenesis. So they have European elements, Asian elements, etc.
Yes, because basically they're the Golden Horde remnant of one group of
right, and then they absorbed a lot of the existing European colonies, the Genoese, the Franks, the some of the Greeks, some of the Armenians.
Quite right. Sorry about that. Go on.
Anyway, so the Crimean Khanate is annexed into the Russian Empire in 1783, and so it no longer exists as an independent state. And before this, it is a major ally of the Ottomans. They sack Moscow twice. They provide a lot of the horsemen for it in combat against Muscovy and Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So after they get down to the Black Sea and take the coast of what is now Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula, this state no longer exists. It's been defeated. And of course, the Crimean Tatars, the Crimean Khanate is also no longer obviously in conflict with the Circassians. But this kind of basically eliminates it down, particularly in the 19th century, even before the Crimean War against the British and French and Ottomans, starting about 1830 to Circassia is the last buffer state there, and the Russians will advance down all the way up until 1877, 1878, the last war they fight against the Ottomans before World War I, when they take Ardahan and Kars, which are now back as part of the Turkish Republic. So this is like a strategic area for them to advance directly south towards that one warm water port that they've always wanted, and to get their away from the freezing cold. And of course, even when it's not cold, freezing cold, the Black Sea, of course, you have to go through the Dardanelles, and even taking the Baltics, you have to go then through the Straits with Sweden and Denmark to get out of Riga.
They also wanted to get down there for the, it's basically like compressing your front. If they could move all the way down and take at least the North Caucasus, to say nothing of the South Caucasus, then they can concentrate their forces in this smaller area with a wall, so to speak, of those mountains. Because on one side you got Derbent, right, which is historically a choke point, and on the other side they get control of it. And they get the control of the northern Black Sea coast, like you said, the warm water port, and they get all that great farmland in the North Caucasus.
Right, and there's also an ideological component between the Circassians and the bulk of the population of both Iran and which is still known as Persia then, and the Ottoman are the Christian Georgians and Armenians who. The Russians, even the Christians among the Arabs, are kind of taken under as a protection of all Eastern Christians.
All the European powers were busy at this time claiming that they had the role of the protector, which is why the French wanted to get involved with Catholics in the Ottoman Empire. The Brits claimed the right to get involved with Protestants, and of course. A couple of different czars were like, basically, we got to come down here and save all the Orthodox. And didn't that was one of the reasons why the Russians came down and allied with Georgia when they invited them down in the 17 whatevers with the Dadianis.
Right, the ideological component of defending and supporting the Christians, particularly the Georgians and Armenians, because there's a lot of them, and they're compactly settled. Particularly the Georgians are. Armenians less so. At that time.
And the Turks were playing the same game, wanting to go north and defend their co-religionists with, limited success mostly, but yeah.
Right. Except for the Crimean War in the 1850s, when the French and British supported the Ottomans, the Russians defeated the Ottomans in every single war that they fought against them.
And lots of those wars between the Russians and the Turks in the Caucasus. Lots of them.
So in almost all those cases, the Ottomans would lose some territory in the Caucasus, sometimes territory in the Balkans, and they would also lose people. So, like Armenians would move across the border from Ottoman territory into the Russian Empire.
The sole, I guess, saving grace of them is that they did develop a reputation, which you can see underscored most strikingly with Gallipoli, for still fighting well defensively. So even against the Russians, where they weren't doing particularly well, they tended to do fairly well in defensive engagements with the Russians, but did rather poorly, unless they were holed up in a fortress.
Right, but 1828, 1829, they lose Meskhetiya, Javakhetiya, which is now part of Georgia. 1877, 1878, they lose Ardahan and Kars, which is not retaken until Ataturk establishes his base in Ankara and wins what they call the War of Independence. So the last part of the Ottoman Empire. Before World War I, and that territory in the northeast is actually, there's the settlements of Volga Germans and Estonians still there from when it was under Tsarist rule.
So coming back to the Circassians, you were giving us the context.
So this is the buffer zone. So this is why they want to get rid of it. And I think what you see here is a modern idea that not only must they get rid of the state, but because of the way that the Circassians are organized as kind of tribal military confederation, in some senses a parallel to the Cossack societies of the Russians themselves, that just destroying the state would not end resistance. So they need to basically destroy, for lack of a better word, what we would call the nation now, the political manifestation of the ethnicity.
Meaning them. They needed to destroy them, in order to get rid of them and actually move them out of the territory. Just a quick parenthesis. There are tons of things about the Caucasus and their dress and their clothing, their equipment, their horsemanship, and the rest that the Cossacks now claim. Now, Circassians may have been involved in the early origins of some of these Cossack groups to some extent, but it is my view across the board that the majority of and it's not all Cossacks. It's not the same with like Don Cossacks. I refer specifically to Terek and Kuban Cossacks, and they, for the most part, just ripped off Circassian clothing and culture.
Right, so the Kuban is the area directly east of the Crimea.
Sorry, those are two river frontiers.
Yeah, and the Terek is the area over by where the Kabardians are, just north of it.
Yes.
And so, and then so the Cossack host there as well as other places, but those are the two major ones in the Caucasus. So they needed to basically destroy not just the Circassian state like they had with the Crimean Khanate, but the Circassian nation. And this is why I think you get these awful massacres starting in the 1830s and this massive expulsion leading to about a third of the population dying in 1860s, particularly after the Battle of Red Meadows on 21st of May, 1864. So in this sense, it's the first modern genocide in that there is a distinct idea that a Circassian collective unit, as it were, has no place to exist anywhere. That anything that is an organic collectivity of this group must be smashed and annihilated. And this takes, of course, an awful lot of violence because it's resisted. And so you end up with most of the population forcibly expelled and about a third of it dying shortly thereafter from the lack of material goods to sustain them, since the Ottomans they were prepared to accept about 50,000 refugees, and they got about 1.5 million, and so large numbers of deaths, both en route, most of it over the Black Sea, but also upon arriving in the territory of the Ottoman Empire. And this is why many of the surviving Circassians are in Syria, over 100,000, or Jordan, over 250,000, some in Israel, as we noted. These are descendants of the expellees that managed to make it into less densely populated areas of the Ottoman Empire and establish Circassian settlements, or as the Arabs refer to them, those people from the Caucasus that hate the Russians.
Yes. They, of course, the largest group of them, as you were probably about to say, is in Turkey proper today. Many of them that ended up in places like Syria and Israel and Jordan got there by way first being settled in the Balkans and then falling afoul with a defeat to the Russians in, what was it, 1878 or 1879. They got pushed out, a short time later and had to move yet again. But were you going to talk at all about the war itself?
Well, I mean, the war lasted a very long time. It was quite brutal, but it was basically 1830 to 1864. There is resistance. The eastern areas are defeated first. It's the western areas that hold out the longest, despite the difference in geography, ironically. And then I suppose the interesting thing is what the effects of this is. So it creates the diaspora. It basically destroys permanently united Circassian nation and greatly reduces the physical population, the demography. So some estimates there'd be something like 25 million Circassians in the world absent the expulsions and deaths.
Whereas there are at present something like 6 or 7 million total.
Yeah, and only about 800,000 of those are in the Russian Federation.
And we saw from that map I showed everybody earlier how their territory was cut down to almost nothing. They're also split. Another point that should be made is that they've been artificially split into these three republics in order to keep them from
Well,
ever
it's
having
even
them.
more complicated than that. So the Soviets decided to organize their state along these ethno-national territories. And so there's 3 for the Circassians. Originally there's 4, but the one got eliminated very early on and never resuscitated. But so the 2 largest actually are shared with other groups that are Turkic, the Kabardino-Balkar Republic and the Karachay-Cherkessian Republic. And during Soviet times, the Turkic groups from there were forcibly deported to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan for a period of 1944 to 1956, and then they returned.
Roughly the time when the Chechens were kicked out as well.
The Chechens were kicked out at the same time. So the Karachais are deported on 2nd of November 1943. The Chechens and English the 23rd to 29th of February 1944, and then the Balkars 8th and 9th of March 1944. But what's interesting is, right, they didn't put the Kabardians and the Cherkasses in a single republic, even though they're both Circassian people, and they didn't put the Karachay and Balkar in a single republic, even though they're both Turkic people. So you would think the division would be, because they're very small groups, you could group them together. You have a Karachay-Balkar Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic and a Circassian Kabardinian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. But they decided to mix different groups together in the same territory.
And to keep them weak and separated. Yeah.
That is one reason, yes. To
also
divide.
Arguably to punish and destroy and eradicate, at least culturally, because for quite some time they weren't allowed to speak their languages. And, it was repression in
but
schools.
when they establish these territories do have official commitment to using indigenous languages, particularly from 1923 to 1939 is the big period of Korenizatsiya or indigenization.
And then did it get throttled back again after that?
It gets throttled back again, and then it gets a little bit more revived after 1956 with the 20th Party Congress and the denunciation of Stalin by Khrushchev.
Then there's another point that should be added in here, which is that though they were treated better and they were co-religionists and they were treated better in many respects, they ran into many of these problems in Turkey because with the armistice, Turkey wasn't defeated. They signed an armistice, unlike I guess there's some parallels there. Let's not go into all that. Anyway, after the end of World War I.
Well, they signed the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923.
Right. What I'm after, though, is basically after World War I, they were convulsed with internal upheaval because Ataturk came in and established the Turkish nation on the sort of the bones of the Ottoman Empire. And that involved all kinds of craziness with Ataturk coming in and promoting this idea of a Güneş dili, where there's a sun language of the original Turks and that everybody's a Turk. Türk'üm diyen, how happy it is for the one person to be able to say he's a Turk. Like nationalism was imposed heavily. You had the shift from the old Ottoman language with the Arabic alphabet, with these new characters and the program for literacy and the abolishment of the fez. And basically everybody's a Turk. If you're a Kurd, shut the hell up, speak Turkish. If you're a Circassian, shut the hell up, speak Turkish. Armenian, Jew, Rum, Christian, doesn't matter. Everybody shut the hell up, speak Turkish. You're all Turks. And so although they didn't have the kind of treatment that they had in Russia, the Circassians suffered there as well with the loss of language and cultural elements as generations go by, disconnected from many of these things.
Right. In many ways, the places they did best were Jordan and Syria, where a lot of them became elites in the military officer corps of those states.
Chechen diaspora as well. There are Chechen generals and the rest.
And ones that came during the Tsarist period.
And so they ended up being scattered about. They ended up in these diasporic countries. Were there other things you wanted to cover about how all of that happened, or is there anything?
Well, I mean, they loaded them on the boats. They sent the boats to Anatolia for the most part for the
right,
expulsion.
And some on the boats over to the Balkans.
Right, which were under Ottoman rule, still parts of it. I mean, Bulgaria was under Ottoman rule until 1878, 1879 war.
Basically, the Ottomans at this time said, "Hey, we got this huge group of people coming in. How can we best use them? We don't have a whole lot to provide them as support." They sort of settled them in a band. Many places are well known, like Uzun Yayla. But they settled them in a band in Anatolia running north to south to protect the western parts of Anatolia from the east. They basically settled them intentionally in order to be a defensive force that was military or paramilitary, using them in many respects the way that the Russians used Cossacks. But they settled the Circassians in parts of Anatolia, running in a line north-south to offer protection, as I recall, if I'm remembering correctly, in much of the Middle East where they were settled. It was to protect Ottoman railway as well as pilgrim traffic. And so they got used in that respect. Many of them were in the military. That was sort of the traditional thing for them to do. Eventually they got set up, doing farming and things again. But they've been pretty much scattered across the Middle East, Anatolia. There's even a community of them in New Jersey in the United States, a fairly large one. And now there has been a movement for some time trying to make arrangements to get back to their homeland.
Yeah, I think most of the ones that have returned have been from Syria because of push factors in Syria itself have added to the pull factors of the homeland.
Right, but the Russians are still not totally on board with the idea of a whole bunch of them coming back. There's a great irony involved here. First off, you got to understand that there were groups like the Natukhai and some elements of the Kabardine aristocracy that really got closely involved with the Russian imperial structure. There were that's another important point to add, actually, is that not all of the Circassians were fighting against Russians. Some came over and fought with them against the other ones. And there were groups that did ally with them and stayed pretty close with them, but a whole bunch of them got thrown under the bus and crapped on by the Russians, despite the fact that they had long been allied with them and had remained faithful to their treaties and obligations with the Russians. The Russians basically decided, you know what, to hell with all y'all, we're going to push you all out.
But it did create an interesting dynamic during the Second World War, because there are no mass deportations of the Circassians. There's a couple hundred Karbards who are deported. And then you look at their neighbors to the east, the Chechens and English, about 500,000 people deported. And then the Karachais and the Balkars, another 100,000 are also deported.
But did the Avars and the Nakh, or the Chechens, did they get pushed out at the same scale as the Circassians when they were defeated in 1859?
No.
Yeah, so there were a whole lot more of them to get rid of. There were just very few of them remain.
It is also, I think, with a sense by the Soviet government that the Circassians had already been defeated in 1864. So
yeah, and there
wasn't a need. Whereas the Chechens, they kept rising up.
Over and over. A
massive guerrilla insurgency starting in 1940 that was still going on at the time of the deportations under Hassan Israelov.
And I believe some of the Circassians, along with like White Cossacks and others, that is Pohl knows.
There were some. There were a small group, a few hundred that were labeled as bandits and collaborators. But this is very small when you look at the you
The
know,
overall numbers.
600,000 Vainaq and Turkic peoples.
No. I'm taking it more specifically. Did some of the Circassians fight alongside white Cossacks with the Germans in World War II?
Some fought with the Germans. I don't know if they fought with the Cossacks specifically. I mean, there were all kinds of units, including a number of general North Caucasian type units. The big North Caucasian unit was a Wehrmacht Ost Legion, which was mostly Dagestani, but the Dagestanis were not deported. So it's not a rhyme or reason regarding correlation between level of collaboration and deportation on any of these people. So
yeah, probably since Stalin was in charge and he was a Georgian, there were probably some things about his understanding of the history in the region that shaped that.
Yeah, and even more so Beria, who was also Georgian, the head of the NKVD.
These damn Georgians. And to this day, they'd like to jump on my channel and be like, a Kinjal, a Kama, that's actually Georgian. All of this is stolen from the Georgians. There's no such thing as Circassian culture. It's all Georgian. Everything's Georgian. It's all Georgian.
But Georgia is the only state to recognize the Circassian genocide.
Now, which is another irony, but let's get to irony number one. Because as I was starting to say, the Russians literally just crushed and smashed and curb stomped the Circassians. And
Correct.
then they were like, let's just do it again. Let's just do it again. Like they're lying, they're bleeding, and they're like, let's curb stomp them again. And maybe just again. They literally just smashed and thrashed them. And so there are very good reasons. That's why I started to talk about, the business of how some of the Circassians fought with the Russians, but most of them didn't. And I wanted to underscore the irony involved in what I'm about to say, which is that along comes, I was supposed to go to the Kabardino-Balkaria to do a conference about Damgas and talk about Circassian culture. I got invited there and they were going to bring me in for the conference. And then that was in 2008, and presto, wham, the South Ossetia thing broke out and the conference was canceled. And I was like, damn it. But from that point, Georgia got a real belligerent attitude with Russia, which had come in and occupied South Ossetia. I mean, anybody who pays attention to geostrategic things would know that Russia would have to do that because that's the Georgian military highway. South Ossetia isn't just a place. It's the point at which the only year-round path, or mostly year-round path through the Caucasus, north to south in the center, has a road. I mean, Yermolov, and tens or hundreds of thousands of Russians died in order to be able to get that military highway north to south. Russia's never going to turn that over. It's like South Ossetia is like the door in the wall of Russia's southern gate. And you think they're going to, there's no way that was going to happen. Anyway, but at that point, Georgia gets all pissed off and says, okay, well, let's just go ahead and embarrass the Russians. And so they release all kinds of stuff in their archives, which this guy Richmond talks about and utilizes. Lots of embarrassing things about how they handle stuff in the Caucasus. They also put up a monument to the Circassian genocide, which is something that pisses off the Russians because they're like, what? Genocide? What? There was no genocide. I have to tell you, no genocide at all.
Genocide нету. Я сказал, genocide нету.
But they turn around, and here is the great irony. In order to push back against Georgia for doing that, the Russians come in and support the Abkhazians, who are one of the groups that managed to stay in the region. And they were busily being crushed and, being told that they don't exist and they have no culture by the Georgians. And so that's the great irony.
Right, and at the same time, the Abkhazians were ethnically cleansing the Greeks.
I guess you have some Pontic Greek communities up in and through there.
Yeah, there were quite a few, actually. There were, it was one of the largest settlements still around because Stalin removed a lot of them in the 40s.
Yeah, what's his name?
Abkhazia was one of the areas that they still had a large settlement in until the war, and then the Abkhazians kicked most of them out into Greece.
Yeah, and some of those, what's his name? Gurdjieff is one of those, his famous student, Ouspensky. Gurdjieff the mystic is one of those Pontic, or I should say, Caucasian Greeks. But the great irony is that Russia comes in and suddenly supports the nationalist aspirations of the Abkhazians in order to peel them off of, much like they're doing in Donetsk and Luhansk in the eastern Ukraine. They come in and they say, let's take this minority group in this country and support
Yeah, except in Donetsk and Lugansk, the minority is Russian.
Is Russian, yes. But
in Georgia, the Ossetians and Abkhaz are groups who would prefer to speak Russian than to speak Georgian, but they're not Russians.
Yeah. Yes, but you can see the consistency with the strategy. And that is the great irony that one of the first of these peoples of the Caucasus, roughly, that you can call a Circassian, depending on your definition. I'm using the sort of medium generality definition, which is all Northwest Caucasian language-speaking peoples. Abkhazians are definitely a part of them.
Obviously, the Karachay and Balkar are not.
Yeah, and they don't speak a Northwest Caucasian language.
Oh, I thought you were talking about just geographically.
No. Northwest Caucasian language group.
Okay.
So the Abkhazians fall into that. Anyway, that's a big thing. Like when I was talking to diasporic Circassians in Turkey around 2006-ish about all this, they were talking about there was a lot of interest in going back there. And then later around 2008 and 2009, there was a bunch of buzz of people wanting to return, going to Abkhazia, and others are now trying to go back, like you talked about with Syria and people wanting to return. We'll see. I mean, what's odd is that the Russians are willing to take farmers from South Africa, Boers, and settle them. That was in farmland just north of the Caucasus too. So, they'll bring Boers from South Africa, but they're not in a big rush to bring a whole bunch of Circassians back from Syria and other places in the Middle East, certainly not from Turkey. So we'll have to see what happens with that. Well, let me ask you this. Did you want to talk any further about like people returning from the diaspora and stuff? Because I want to go over some books that people can look at if they want to learn more
my
about
understanding is that some have, but that it hasn't become a rush because the Russian government has not made it easy. So it is not, there are many obstacles for people of Circassian descent to quote unquote return to the Caucasus.
Somebody in the chat just said this story about taking South Africans is mostly a sham. Yeah, I don't know what the details are of that. I heard about it early on. It may well be that it never really eventuated. I'd be interested to know though. So, shoot me a comment in the comment section under the video so it'll stay,
They have taken recently, since in the last couple of years, a lot of Ukrainians or people from Ukraine. Many of those are ethnic Russian. A lot, as the number of ethnic Russians coming in from Kazakhstan and Central Asia has declined because, everybody who's already wanted to go to the Russian Federation already has, they've now gotten a new wave of ethnic Russians coming from Ukraine to move to the Russian Federation. So in actuality, if you look at immigrants and their children, even though there's a large number of people from places like Tajikistan, they're not doing too badly because they've got a fair number of ethnic Russians that were coming in from Central Asia and Kazakhstan, and now that that's dwindled, they've managed to replace it with those from Ukraine.
So we'll have to see where they, how these policies of resettlement and return and things play out. It may be, I think it's probably going to depend heavily upon how Russia can weaponize it for its purposes. In my view, it seems that their strategy is simply to maintain key strategic points along the Black Sea coast. As many people have heard me talk about in geopolitical streams, they've got Transnistria, they've got Crimea, they've got Abkhazia, they've got South Ossetia. So rather than having to control everything, they've got the eastern parts of the Ukraine. Rather than having to control everything, they've focused on just keeping a footprint in key areas, just like Kaliningrad. And actually, as I pointed out in other streams, if you draw a line from Kaliningrad down to some of these Black Sea areas that we're talking about, that's actually the narrowest width point of Europe. So if they wanted to basically, concentrate their forces at the narrowest width point of Europe moving over into their region, you just draw yourself a straight line from Kaliningrad down to the Black Sea, and you can begin to see why they're keeping forces where they are,
Right.
so that they have
But
the
this is
ability
actually
to cut it off.
A much smarter strategy than the Soviets were pursuing and just trying to keep all the territory.
Right. This way, they don't have to expend their resources, but they still keep the critical points that they need.
But my point was more that there's a big deal made about immigration, particularly from Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan, and the high birth rates into the Russian Federation, and that when you look at the ethnic breakdown of all of the former Soviet states, and now Ukraine is a large participant as well. In point of fact, they're keeping even. They're not becoming more Muslim. They're
Sure.
having enough Russians to offset the increase in Muslim population.
Yeah, and my point that I was aiming at, agreed. My point that I'm aiming at is that the best hope that Circassians have for having their nationalist aspirations recognized by Russians is to have themselves located on non-Russian territory that the Russians want for strategic purposes, at which point they'll likely come in just like with the South Ossetians and Abkhazians and be like, yeah, we can help you, so.
Yeah, but I don't think that's what the current desire is. I mean, the Kabardino-Balkar Republic and the Karachay-Cherkessia Republic and the Edegai Oblast, these are all heavily subsidized by Moscow. They all have some degree of autonomy. The two they share with the Turks, obviously, they don't have complete control over.
Adygea is the one that's probably doing the best.
Adygea is the smallest, and it's also geographically split into more than one territory there in Krasnodar. But I don't think the idea was that they would become fully independent states. The idea was that the Circassians and mostly, I guess, Syria, maybe some extent Jordan. I think the ones in Turkey are more assimilated because of Ataturk's hard line that everybody was a Turk, or as I called them in Iraq, a Valley Kurd.
Right. Well, then let's so we'll see what the future holds for them. I certainly wish them the best. I'm going to share some books and then throw in some closing thoughts. Is there anything else you wanted to cover before that?
I think you already went over, but yeah, the British wanted to use the Circassians as an ally during the Crimean War, and as a cheap way of foiling the Russians, keep them bogged down in the Caucasus and not moving in Central Asia towards India, particularly the Northwest Territory, what is now Pakistan. But the British weren't willing to give any real material assistance. They just wanted the Circassians to fight the Russians so that they wouldn't be fighting against British interests. So that is one of the geopolitical elements that in there. The modernity of it, they say this is the first time probably ever where a state decides it has to destroy a society, not just its government. I mean, obviously there are cases much earlier on, but in modern times recording, this I think is the first one. We don't have anything really like that in the 19th or 18th or 17th centuries, really.
No, they came in and they decided we're going to wipe these people out. They really, I mean, when you look at the military decisions and the rest, yes, some few survived here and there, sort of token, but they really they smashed the entire culture.
So in that sense, perhaps it's kind of a revision, because usually they put that idea as coming a little bit later with the Germans in Namibia against the Herero, who revolted. But that's in 1904 and 1907, so that's after 1864. Yeah,
nobody wants us talking about this one. Russia certainly doesn't. And, honestly, what do Armenians or Jews have to gain from somebody talking about a genocide before them? So you hear very little about it. Although, to be fair, the Circassian relationship with the Israelis, the Circassian communities in Israel are, as I understand it, treated well and trusted. They're allowed to serve in the military, and they're allowed to keep their
but they're
communities
also
and
very
identities.
small. We were talking 5,000 people.
Yeah, very few.
And they are very, very different ethnically, of course, from the Arabs, who are the majority of Muslims in Israel. You see the same thing with the Chechens in Israel, another Muslim group who serve in the Israeli military force, who are very, very distinct culturally from the Arab Muslims.
Yeah, most people don't understand how heterogeneous the populations are all along the Levant there, in part because, obviously it's much older, but the Ottomans in particular, mixed a lot of things up with their games moving populations around. The Russians certainly weren't alone in that.
Right.
Yeah,
even all the way up to the end of the war. So that's why there's an Armenian quarter in Beirut, and one in Damascus. Those people weren't there for. Most of those people weren't there until World War One, when they either fled there or were sent there. And in some cases, like Beirut and Jerusalem, the local governors protected the Armenians sent there. So that's why they're there and not in other places.
Right. Well, I just want to underscore that thing about the Brits just crapped all over them. They promised them the sun, moon, and the stars, used them, and then threw them in the garbage. They really did. Now, some of the people who were actually involved, probably that day's equivalent of secret agents, did continue to agitate for it and publish books and try to get their plight recognized. But the British government just shat upon the Circassians, and they should share responsibility with the Russians for how they behaved. And the Ottomans, in many respects, did some things for them, but it was a mixed bag. And the Ottomans are part of the mess too. Although they took them in, it's a mixed bag. They've just been treated badly by everyone, which I'm going to cover in my sort of closing remarks. But do you have anything else? Because then I'll do books I want to recommend, and then closing remarks.
No, I think I've said everything I wanted to say. Thank you for having me on the show. And
we'll still be here for a bit. We'll get to the thank yous, and I'll plug your channel and everything there.
Okay. Well, before that, I guess I think it should be looked in kind of as a holistic. So one of the things that didn't really come out here is that there aren't the only people that are pushed out of the Russian Empire at this time. So there are a lot of Crimean Tatars that are pushed out after the Crimean War. In fact, more Crimean Tatars are expelled from Crimea after the Crimean War than are deported during the Second World War, because there's a lot more still there. It's not nearly to the scale of the Circassians, but there is a depopulation. And there's also, as we mentioned, a number of Chechens are pushed out. That's why there are Chechens in Jordan and Syria and Israel, because they, like the Circassians, are kicked out into the Ottoman Empire, although obviously on a much smaller scale than what happens to the Circassians.
Yeah, and the Karachay being pushed out, Balkars for a time being pushed out, they got resettled like the Chechens. There's just a lot of that going on with the Russians. They just, they have ways of doing things. Yes. Well, let me start with this book. You know something about it. You turned me on to this guy. This is one of his two books. Despite the fact that I was kind of coming at him laterally, talking about how he's.
You're right that he is a leftist. I've known him personally for a very long time, and if you read the acknowledgments of his first book, it was a kind of inkling how we met. But he was a Russian literature guy, like weird 1920s Russian literature. And I got I don't know what you want to call it, A guest editorship for the Journal of Genocide Research in 2000 from Henry Huttenbach to do Soviet deportations.
Right.
And he wanted to do, like everybody else, Chechens. And I said, Dr. Richmond, everybody wants to do Chechens, but nobody wants to do the Northwest Caucasus. What if you do the Karachais? And so he did the Karachais, and then he got interested in the Northwest Caucasus as the whole of the region, and later hooked up with the Circassians. But he was not into genocide or deportations or military history at all when I first met him. He just decided that we were going to move in a different direction, and he of course moved in a big way.
Well, I'm very happy that he did. So, all sideways sniping aside, it's great when any scholar comes in.
He's always been a political leftist.
That's fine.
That was always the case.
The main point I want to make is that I'm grateful for the fact that he has translated what he has and made this information available, because that's one of the major things. If you are Circassian and you are watching this, one of the biggest things that you need to be doing is producing English language translations of your important work. The fact that Khan Girai's work on the Circassians, that's history of the Circassians produced by a Circassian, the fact that it is not available in English, and all it would cost you is paying a couple translators and editors to produce it. Like, why the Circassians have not made strong moves to make their own documents available in English so that you don't have to be a Russian specialist. It's beyond me. Like, God helps those who help themselves.
Right. You want me to translate it? Just make me an offer, but I'm really cheap, so.
Right.
You can get me for less than almost anybody else.
There are some other books that I want to touch here. I'll look at them. I'll look at it. I'll look at it, Dr. Pohl. We can talk about the possibilities of you helping with translation, because I want to get somebody on translating Khan Girai. And you know why I'm motivated to do it? Because I want to read it. That's why I want to read it. These people have always fascinated me. I've collected things from their material culture for quite some time. The aesthetic of the Circassians, the quality of their metalwork, the depth and impressiveness of their martial traditions. They're just absolutely, this group of people should be remembered. It's very, very important that they be remembered. I think it's important for nationalists and for the right wing to remember them, because they are a people who've been shattered and scattered. And, in many respects, you can look at London as what do they call them? Stanitsas? What are the Cossack settlements called?
Stanitsa, yeah.
Yeah, you can look at London as like a Pakistani and Somali stanitsa that's been established in the Circassian territory of Britain. If I'm not stretching these metaphors ridiculously.
I think you're stretching the metaphor, but
right. But the idea is that they bring in replacement.
Foreign settlement on conquered land, yes.
Yes, and they're bringing them in, and they're busy all across the West settling people to replace the population there. And you get to see what happens when your culture has to get replaced, or your cultures. I should be very precise about that. When your cultures and peoples, the cultures and peoples of the West, get replaced by people who come in, and your history becomes something like this, an antique. Related to a half-remembered past. We should all be looking at what happened to the Circassians and considering, how to avoid having it happen for us. But I think that there are people who should be looked upon with some sympathy, and certainly, and not a patronizing sympathy, but as an interesting example of a people who fought long and hard. How many people can say that they fought for 60 years to defend their homeland against a power like Russia, when there were as few of them as in fact there were? So yeah, they're interesting in that respect, and I think they hold out a lesson for all people on the dissident right, for all nationalists. But let me go on with the books here. This is by Hewitt. Oh, and I should also say none of these scholars are likely to endorse any of the stuff that I'm saying.
But Hewitt is a strange guy.
I would guess he did. He married a Abkhazian, didn't he?
He did marry an Abkhazian, but you know what? They didn't speak to each other in Abkhaz. They spoke to each other in Georgian.
Yeah, well, I imagine Abkhazian's not easy to learn. And the other thing I should say is none of these scholars would endorse any of the kind of stuff we're talking about, all this right-wing stuff. I'm guessing most of them are probably strongly left-wing. all academics.
Richmond is on the far left.
Yeah, and I'm imagining most of these people, simply because they've got academic degrees, you're an exception. Most people with a PhD in academia are not on the right. Like literally like 10% of people in academia with PhDs.
I don't know. I mean, he doesn't deal with Circassians, so probably haven't gone around. But Brian Williams, who's written a lot on Crimean Tatars and Chechens, he's fairly right.
Right-wing.
Compared to most.
Execute the plan. But anyway, I want to say that the fact that I have the politics that I do, and we're talking about these academics, there's no doubt that they would not support them for the most part. So, don't connect them in any way to what we're talking about politically. They stand on their own. And regardless of their politics, I'm thankful, very thankful, that they have done the work that they have done. So anyway, there's George Hewitt, who's done this on the Abkhazians. Again, this is part of the series, which is odd. I guess it was St. Martin's Press. And then this series moved on to being Rutledge, at which point it also became crappy in paperback.
After he retired from SOAS, they didn't hire anybody else. So there's nobody doing Caucasus at all now at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And there's only one person doing Central Asia.
And the whole reason that they were doing it? The only reason that any of those people were paying attention and this series came out and you had conferences and this book was one that that Richmond was encouraged to do. Now, I don't know the facts, I'm guessing, but it's simply because they were trying that whole push to peel off Georgia with support from people like Soros in order to run pipelines through there. They wanted to peel the South Caucasus off of Russia, just like the Brits did.
Which is on Germans, Crimean Tatars, and Meskhetian Turks in the Soviet Union. When I came to Washington, D.C. to do some research for it, I got the invite from a couple of places, and one of them was the Middle East Institute on DuPont Circle. Are you familiar with these people?
No.
They are basically the think tank of the oil industry. It's a very nice little building off of DuPont Circle, but basically, to sell it, the woman who was representing me was a Crimean Tatar from Turkey. Basically, oil pipeline. That's what they wanted to hear about, because they were building the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline.
Right, and there are other variations of them.
Javaketia.
There are other variations that they want to do now that they're considering. And so that's very much a big question, is how all that's going to shake out. And at the time that you probably saw these, peoples of the Caucasus, they were trying to peel Georgia off, or having some success with it. This is before South Ossetia. I'm sure that this is driven by the same thing. These kinds of think tanks, if not the one you're talking about, and it's likely it was involved, if not that one, then one's just like it, basically got on the phone and they said,
actually, as you notice, Walt talks about the Jamestown Foundation, which he refused to have anything to do with, just because they seem to be quite connected with a lot of U.S. deep state organizations.
Yeah. Deep state, yes. And three-letter agencies,
one that starts with a C, ends with an A.
Right, has an I in the middle, yeah.
Right.
So there is a lot of that. And I would expect that it's money from either intelligence services or oil companies, and that kind of energy companies, I should say, that drives a lot of whether or not academics choose to look at this thing. I happily, as an independent scholar, much like you, am pursuing these things because they personally interest me. I didn't get turned on to the Circassian history because it's convenient, or there would be some sort of endowment available to me. I got involved with it because I love these things.
You notice, like, when you get the little bit that they throw you, like if they give you funding to go fly to a conference, right? You notice it will have some sort of these connections with these. Like I did the conference in Moscow on Kurds in Russia, which was financed by the French government. But the guy who got that financing, he told me, we told the French government exactly what they wanted to hear, so they would give us the money.
Right, and that's how it works. You need to know what side of your bread is buttered on. So yeah, my interest in this is that I have sympathy, but not a patronizing sympathy. I have an interest in the Circassians. I think they're fascinating people. I think their culture is fascinating, and they deserve our attention and our help in their struggle to reconstitute what they can of their cultures and nations. But let's just run through the last of these books. This is Nart Sagas. from the Caucasus. This is by John Colarusso. This is a partial translation of the not sagas. They call them sagas, loosely speaking, but they're very, very old traditional stories from the Caucasus. I think the argument is that they that maybe they have more of an Iranic or Indo-Iranian, Indo-European core, but they have been, and so, you know, perhaps there are aspects of it that go back to the first settlement of the Ossetis in this region. However, these stories are taken up and are a part of the sort of lore and tradition of all the peoples of the Caucasus to some extent. You know, you'll meet Circassians named Nart, you know, and I believe this is a Kabardian family that's colorized here and shown on the cover, you know, of their women. So this is a great book. It's not all of them. It's translated from Russian. Colarusso is also a specialist in West Caucasian languages. I believe he's out of Canada. There is this, which is, you know, I like to throw in a lot of odd things. I met some of the people in this crew. This is a book called Abkhazians, The Science of Universal Awe. It's sort of like a Caucasian, Circassian yoga and mysticism. This was put out by a guy named Murat Yagan, who was up in Canada. He has since passed away in his 90s. As I said, I met some of his people and corresponded with him very briefly regarding some things related to damgas. I wanted to speak to someone who might know about such things, the marks and signs of the tribes. He was able to provide a little bit of direction. And then leave out, well, I guess I'll just mention it. There's some of my work in this, traditional marking systems, that in part discusses the Circassians, the book I'm translating, and the importance of damgas. But there are many others. It's a whole bunch of archaeology.
It's the Tatar thingy.
Yeah, the Tarak. Tamaga, yeah, Tamga. Yeah, it's the Tarak trident. It's a book on mark, so I showed I designed the cover. So I showed that Damga on the cover. Yes. But for people who are into the material culture, there are really two great places to start. Sadly, the books are a bit difficult to find. This is edited by Yuri Miller, and I believe it's Danish. I think it is. Somebody who speaks one of those damn ice monkey Viking languages can tell me whether it's Danish or Norwegian or whatever. I think it's Danish. Vaven Historisk Arborg. Yeah, Danish Arms and Armor Society. So this is in Danish, but it's got English translations of the Danish text. It's Caucasian arms and armor from the State Hermitage Museum in Moscow or St. Petersburg, sorry. And this is hard to get your hands on. It's expensive, like all these material culture books, but man, it is just full of gorgeous, all the best treasures, weapons from the Caucasus were of course taken up to Russia. And you get examples like this. This is a powder horn decorated with gilding and yellow. This is very much the Circassian aesthetic, which is just, in my view, absolutely unparalleled, just absolutely gorgeous. So this book is just a collection of some of the best stuff, and it kind of underscores how fine this kama I have is, which is from about 1800, which is about prehistoric for the Caucasus. Sadly, this one is not gilded in the same way, but you can see stylistically it shares quite a bit. The stuff from the other areas of the Caucasus doesn't have that. The Circassian is just badass. Now, the last two ones I'll give you before we get out of here. This is by Astvat Saturian, an Armenian woman who is a scholar of Circassian weapons. This is the old one. It's of course available only in Russian. If you want to get into this stuff, you got to speak Russian, or like me, just look at the pictures and maybe translate a caption, which is all that's within my powers.
Weapons of the peoples of the Caucasus.
Yes. And then this is a reissue of that. This is Asfat Saturian, but this is the better one. This is the newer one, and it is it's thicker and higher quality printing than the previous one. And that one with the collection from St. Petersburg is
How
good.
many books are there with the same title? They're all weapons of the peoples of the Caucasus.
Well, this one is a reissue of that same book, but with more photos and higher quality. So this is the one I recommend. Other really fine examples of of the Circassian aesthetic. Their kinjals, kamas, shashkas, Bulatuk, ayat, saddles and the rest. So yeah, it's a great one. Lots going into the patterns and themes with their metal work. The saddles in and of themselves, for those who are interested, I have one other clip on this channel that kind of really deals with the Caucasus and Circassians. It's called Kama, or Kinjal. And I've just looked specifically at these weapons. I'm hopefully going to do one in the future on saddles, because I have a few saddles. I've also gotten to photograph a number of them in private collections. So I'm going to be talking about the Circassian saddle as well. But I think I've been rambling for quite long enough. Thank you all for your patience. Let me now turn to this opportunity to shill my own channel. You can follow me here, Semigog, as well as a Safer Space on YouTube. But do be aware, if you came in and watched this because you're into Circassians, just fair warning, the vast majority of my content is not about Circassian. I've done 2 videos now on Circassians in the Caucasus, so don't expect to subscribe and see lots of this material. I just talked about it this time. I wanted to talk about it.
I have done no shows on Circassians, but I've done a couple on Chechens.
Right. So, yeah, we just wanted to, both Otto and I wanted to talk about this because it's May 21st, a day that we should all remember as being the day that the Circassians were driven out of their homeland after their final defeat. So, yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, on Telegram, on Gab. I saw some people in the chat asking how they can get in touch with me. If you want to reach me related to academic stuff or my translation work and the rest, you can get me at Semiogog, just like my channel name is spelled, at protonmail.com. But you can also DM me on Twitter or jump over to Telegram or whatever. Yeah, and I should just, let me do this very quickly. I should properly give a shout out to the people who make this channel possible, because I didn't at the outset. I wanted to jump into this quickly. These are the Praetorian Chads who make all of this possible. These are the people who support the channel. These are the ones who have donated, contribute to making this happen. So many thanks to them. As it goes, all the credit and none of the blame. So now in closing, Dr. Pohl, I'm going to jump over to you and say, what do you want to shill on your channel? Where can people find you? Where can they follow you?
Yeah, my channel for YouTube is Jonathan Pohl, and it's I'm still 77 subs away from 1,000 subscribers after 4 years, so I'm so close, but yet so far away.
You will achieve it, my friend. You will achieve it.
And then for my academic work, Otto Pohl, academia.edu, I have a lot of the smaller pieces. I do have quite a few pieces on Crimean Tatars. I have one piece on the North Caucasus, but it's on the Turkic and Vaynaq deportations in '44. And then I have a Substack called Musings of a 21st Century Musings of the 20th Century, or something like that, with very short pieces. But yeah, those are what I've got up there. And I've just finished a book that will be published out of Europe, but in English. So hopefully I can sell one copy to all 11,900 subscribers of Semiagog. And that would be okay.
Go for it, man. If you can make it happen, that'll be good. Well, I endorse Dr. Pohl's channel. Step over there, check it out, get him over the line to 1,000 subscribers. I'll continue at intervals to do some things on the Circassians on the Caucasus, because I find it fascinating. There will be more. As I said, probably the next one will be about saddles. And I am almost done with translating marks of the Caucasian tribes and some stories and notable events related to their leaders. Once I have the English translation finished, I will turn it over to an Ottoman specialist in order to check my translation from the Ottoman. And I will be putting it together in an edition with a updated Romanized version of the Turkish, so that Turkish readers can read the original without having to know the Arabic alphabet, Ottoman. There are some versions of it floating around that purport to be purport to be a Turkish update in modern characters, but it's very, very sloppy. Nothing negative about the people who did the pioneering work to try to get it out, but now having gone through the entire thing, translating it from Ottoman and first transliterating it before doing so, there are lots of mistakes in that translation that's available in Turkish online. I'll have the English translation, I'll have the Turkish translation, and then I hope to use the English to produce a Russian one, put them together all in one volume. So ladies and gentlemen, that is the end for me. I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Pohl. And there'll be more in the future. I appreciate your patience. That's all for now. I am Semiagog, and I am out.
All right.